Have you heard what happened to Anthony Joshua today? It's hard to even put into words, because the reality is something almost nobody could have imagined. A car crash in Nigeria. A crash that left 2 people dead, shattered families, and left the world asking the same question. How did one of the greatest athletes of our generation end up in such a terrifying situation, alive but shaken, with his own family in tears? The images emerging from Lagos are haunting. Anthony Joshua, shirtless, dazed, sitting amidst the wreckage of an SUV, glass scattered like diamonds across the floor, sunlight glinting off the chaos. It's a scene that seems almost cinematic, almost unreal. And yet, it happened. Today, on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, a stretch of road that is all too familiar with accidents, Anthony Joshua's life intersected with tragedy in a way that will haunt the sports world for months, if not years. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about it. Anthony Joshua, the man who has held the world in awe with his fists, who has conquered some of the most formidable opponents in heavyweight boxing, who has walked into arenas with the kind of confidence that makes people lean forward in their seats in anticipation. And yet, here he is, vulnerable in the back seat of a vehicle, his security detail trailing behind, his fate, for a moment, completely out of his hands. He was seated behind the driver, along with another passenger, when the SUV collided with a stationary truck. Reports now indicate that the vehicle was moving beyond the legally prescribed speed limit and lost control while making an overtaking maneuver. You can picture it, can't you? One moment, the road stretches ahead, the hum of tires, the certainty of control. The next, metal crunches, glass shatters, and the world narrows to that single, terrifying instant. And it wasn't just Anthony. 5 men were involved in the collision in total, according to Nigerian road safety officials. 2 of them, tragically, did not survive. There's a jarring human element here that makes this story impossible to ignore. Lives ended, futures erased, families left to grapple with questions that have no easy answers. And Anthony Joshua, alive, shaken, and injured, was pulled into a swirl of emotions and media frenzy that none of us could have anticipated. You have to wonder, how did Anthony Joshua, someone trained to anticipate danger, someone whose life is all about control, strategy, and precision, end up in this situation? The answer is complicated, tragic, and yet, somehow, miraculous. It begins, like all disasters, with a single moment of miscalculation, compounded by circumstances beyond anyone's control. An SUV, moving too fast, attempting an overtaking maneuver. A parked truck, unmoving and seemingly innocuous. 5 men, each with their own story, caught in the chain reaction. And one of the most recognizable figures in modern sports caught in the middle. The images circulating online are almost impossible to watch without holding your breath. Footage shows Anthony Joshua sitting in the wrecked vehicle, shirtless, his body covered in shards of glass, eyes wide with shock, trying to comprehend the immediacy of what just happened. And then there are the moments that followed. Him in the front seat of another vehicle, speaking to officials, trying to explain, to rationalize, to understand. He sustained minor injuries and was taken to the hospital, but the emotional scars, the shock, the fear, the awareness that lives were lost around him. These are far less visible, but no less real. And here's the part that grips everyone on a deeply human level, the reaction of his family. Jacob Joshua, his brother, and Robert Joshua, his father, were in tears. Can you imagine that moment? Receiving the news that your son, your brother, your champion, had been involved in a deadly accident? The mix of relief, fear, guilt, and heartbreak must be almost unbearable. These are people who have shared victories, celebrated milestones, and now are confronted with a scenario no family should ever face. The vulnerability of the moment cuts through the bravado and fame that surrounds Anthony Joshua like armor. Why does this matter now? Because it's not just a car crash. It's a reminder of the fragility of life, even for those we perceive as invincible. Anthony Joshua's life is a global commodity, his body a symbol of strength, his persona one of confidence and triumph. And yet, today, all of that power and fame meant nothing in the face of circumstance. It's a universal lesson disguised as celebrity news. The road does not discriminate, and neither does fate. And there are layers here that will unfold over the coming hours, days, and weeks. Authorities are investigating, details are emerging, and the questions keep piling up. Why was the SUV moving at such a speed? What caused the driver to lose control? How exactly did the security team respond? And could more have been done to prevent this? There are technical, emotional, and human components to this story that will demand attention. Every new fact, every new video or report will deepen the public's understanding of what truly happened that morning on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. But let's return to Anthony for a moment. This is a man whose life is defined by precision, by discipline, by calculated risk. He steps into the ring, anticipating every punch, every move, every possibility. And yet, a car crash, something outside his training, outside his experience, throws him into chaos. It's a stark contrast, a cruel irony that is difficult to ignore. The world watches athletes like Anthony Joshua and assumes invincibility, forgetting that no amount of strength or fame can shield anyone from the random, unpredictable blows of life. And now, the public is grappling with an uncomfortable mix of emotions. Relief that Anthony Joshua survived, grief for those who did not, curiosity about the circumstances, and awe at the sheer randomness of fate. Social media is ablaze with footage, eyewitness accounts, and speculation. Fans are debating every detail. Was the vehicle traveling too fast? Could the crash have been prevented? What does this mean for Joshua's future fights, his career, his life? Every tweet, every comment, every shared clip adds another layer to the narrative, transforming a single tragic event into a global story with endless angles. Consider the emotional impact. The people directly involved, Joshua, the passengers, the security team, are grappling with trauma, with questions that will echo for months. The families of the victims are mourning, facing a reality that no words can soften. And Joshua's own family, Jacob and Robert Joshua, are confronted with the terrifying fragility of life. Every frame of footage, every news report, brings the horror closer, transforming distant tragedy into something intimate, something relatable. And yet, there is a thread of resilience woven into this narrative. Anthony Joshua survived. He walked away with minor injuries. That is not insignificant. There is something profoundly human about the ability to survive, to endure, and to face a world that has suddenly become uncertain. But survival comes with its own burdens, survivor's guilt, public scrutiny, and the ever-present question of what if. What if the vehicle had taken a slightly different path? What if the overtaking maneuver had failed differently? What if his family hadn't received timely updates? Every what if compounds the emotional weight, creating a tension that is both gripping and heartbreaking. And that is why this story resonates far beyond the confines of celebrity news. It is a story about vulnerability, about fate, about the delicate balance between life and death. It is about the fact that even the strongest, most disciplined individuals are not immune to tragedy. It is about the way a single moment, a fraction of a second, can alter countless lives forever. So what happens next? Authorities are investigating. Joshua is recovering. But the implications of this crash ripple outward. Questions of accountability, road safety, personal responsibility, and even chance all collide in ways that are both fascinating and terrifying. And as the hours unfold, more details are likely to emerge. Details that could redefine what the world thinks it knows about this incident, Anthony Joshua's life, and the fragile nature of human existence. The crash on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway is more than news. It is a story of survival, loss, and the haunting unpredictability of life. It is a story that will demand our attention, our empathy, and our reflection. And as we begin to peel back the layers of what happened, one thing becomes clear. The world as we know it shifted for Anthony Joshua, for his family, and for everyone watching. And yet, this is only the beginning. The most shocking revelations, the ones that will make you question everything you thought you knew, are still to come. It was just past 11 a.m. on a Monday, a day that seemed like any other for Anthony Joshua, the man whose name has become synonymous with power, resilience, and unshakable confidence. He had traveled to Nigeria for personal business, for family, for reasons that were meant to be routine, ordinary even. But as fate would have it, what was supposed to be an ordinary day turned into a nightmare the likes of which no one could have imagined. Imagine the scene: the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, one of the busiest and most dangerous stretches of road in Nigeria. The sun was high, the traffic flowing in a chaotic but familiar rhythm, trucks lumbering along the lanes, cars weaving in and out as drivers attempted to make up for lost time. Anthony Joshua, seated in the back of a black SUV, likely catching his breath from the events of the past week, talking quietly with his companions, perhaps reflecting on his career, his family, the fights he had won, the victories that had defined him as one of the world's most celebrated athletes. For a brief moment, he was just another person in a car, trusting the hands of the driver, trusting that the road would carry him safely to his destination. And then it all went wrong. The SUV, a powerful vehicle capable of speeds most of us can barely comprehend, was moving beyond the legally prescribed limit. The driver, whether in a moment of miscalculation or in an attempt to navigate the thick morning traffic, attempted an overtaking maneuver. A stationary truck loomed ahead, a hulking, immovable object that should have been easily avoidable if all conditions were perfect. But life rarely operates in perfect conditions. The SUV lost control. Metal collided with metal. Glass shattered, sending shards flying in every direction. Passengers screamed. Tires skidded across asphalt. In that instant, time stretched and contracted all at once. The world reduced to a series of terrifying moments that felt infinite and fleeting at the same time. Anthony Joshua's world, for that split second, ceased to be about victories, about fame, about the roar of stadiums. It was about survival. The sensation of impact, the sudden jerk of the vehicle, the shattering of glass, the instinctive flinch of his body, it all became raw, overwhelming, unrelenting. You can almost see him there, in the back seat, shirtless, dazed, glass cutting against his skin, adrenaline and shock battling each other in every muscle of his body. And then there was silence. But the silence was deceptive. Outside the vehicle, chaos reigned. Witnesses began to gather. Phones were lifted. Emergency calls were made. Other vehicles on the expressway swerved to avoid the wreckage, horns blaring in panic. The world had shifted from the mundane rhythm of a Monday morning to something entirely unrecognizable. It's almost impossible to overstate the emotional impact of a moment like this. Anthony Joshua, the boxer who has faced down some of the most dangerous men in the ring, who has taken punches that would make ordinary men crumble, was now confronted with something beyond any sparring session, beyond any championship bout. There was no referee, no rules, no cornermen to guide him through this. Just the raw unpredictability of life, and the knowledge that two lives, as we would soon learn, had been lost in this moment. Jacob Joshua, his brother, and Robert Joshua, his father, were elsewhere, living their lives unaware of the storm that had just hit their family. And yet, almost immediately, word began to spread. Calls, messages, urgent texts, each one a thread pulling them toward the realization that something had gone horribly wrong. Can you imagine that moment? Waiting, hoping it's just a rumor, just a mistake, only to have the details slowly crystallize into a horrifying reality? Anthony himself, in those first moments after the crash, had little time to process. Minor injuries, yes, but injuries pale in comparison to the trauma, to the sudden awareness that lives were lost around him. And yet, he was alive, a fact that would both bring relief and haunt him with survivor's guilt in the coming hours. He was pulled from the wreckage, helped into another vehicle, and began interacting with officials, speaking in a voice that must have been a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief. What's striking, even as we recount this, is the duality of the moment. For Anthony Joshua, the survivor, it was a brush with death that would forever alter his perception of safety, control, and mortality. For the families of those who perished, it was the abrupt, cruel interruption of life as they knew it. A sudden void that could never be filled. And for the public, watching through phones and screens, it became a story that was impossible to turn away from. Every detail, every piece of footage, every eyewitness account added another layer to the narrative, transforming it into something both sensational and profoundly human. The driver of the SUV, the passenger seated next to Joshua, the men following behind as part of his security detail. Each person would have a story, a perspective, a moment frozen in time that no one else would ever fully understand. The SUV's speed, the overtaking maneuver, the stationary truck. These are facts, yes, but they cannot convey the fear, the shock, the sudden vulnerability experienced by every human being caught in that instant. And then there's the question of why. Why this moment? Why now? Why Anthony Joshua, someone whose life is defined by control, strategy, and preparation, who has faced danger in the ring and emerged victorious time and time again? Life, of course, rarely offers answers to such questions. Sometimes the only thing we have is the raw impact of events and the way they ripple outward, touching lives we may never fully comprehend. In Nigeria, authorities quickly began to piece together what had happened. Their preliminary reports suggest that the SUV was traveling beyond the speed limit. The driver's overtaking maneuver had failed, and the collision with the parked truck was inevitable in that context. 5 men were involved in the incident, 2 of whom tragically lost their lives. It is a sobering reminder that accidents are rarely simple, rarely isolated. They are a complex web of human choices, mechanical realities, and sheer, unyielding chance. The reactions that followed are almost as striking as the crash itself. Social media erupted with footage and eyewitness accounts. News organizations scrambled to verify details. Fans of Anthony Joshua and casual observers alike shared, debated, and speculated. Some expressed relief that he survived. Others expressed outrage at the circumstances. Still others were struck by the sheer randomness of life, the fragility of human existence, and the unsettling reality that a single moment could upend everything. Anthony Joshua's own family, meanwhile, faced a crisis of their own. Jacob Joshua, his brother, and Robert Joshua, his father, were left grappling with the immediate aftermath, fear for their loved one, grief for those lost, and a sudden awareness of life's unpredictability. You can imagine the tension, the uncertainty, the knot of emotions that must have gripped them as they waited for news, for updates, for confirmation that their son, their brother, was alive. And yet, even as we recount these events, the story is far from complete. Today's crash is only the opening act in a saga that will unfold over hours, days, and weeks. Investigations will continue. Questions of accountability, speed, road safety, and human error will dominate headlines. And Anthony Joshua, the man whose life is defined by discipline and preparation, will have to navigate not only the physical aftermath, but the emotional, psychological, and public consequences as well. It's impossible not to reflect on the contrast between the controlled chaos of a boxing ring and the uncontrolled chaos of life itself. In the ring, Joshua anticipates every punch, every feint, every possible outcome. Outside the ring, he is vulnerable like anyone else, subject to forces entirely beyond his control. The irony is stark, the contrast almost unbearable. And yet, it is a truth we all share. No amount of training, no amount of preparation, no amount of fame or strength can insulate anyone from the unpredictability of existence. As we move forward in this story, the questions only multiply. How did the crash happen in such a way that Joshua survived? What could have been done differently? How are his family and those involved coping? And most importantly, what does this event mean for the man whose career has been built on resilience, courage, and survival? The answers will unfold, piece by piece, revealing a narrative that is as much about human frailty as it is about celebrity and fame. But for now, one thing is clear. The day that started like any other for Anthony Joshua ended in chaos, tragedy, and a level of uncertainty that few can imagine. The moment of impact is a blur in the mind, but the details, as reconstructed from eyewitness accounts, social media footage, and official reports, paint a chilling and unforgettable picture. It was shortly after 11 a.m. when Anthony Joshua's SUV, a black Lexus, approached a section of the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway near Magon. The sun was glaring, the road crowded with a mix of commercial trucks, private vehicles, and motorcycles weaving in and out. For anyone who drives in Nigeria, the expressway is both familiar and treacherous, an artery of commerce and movement, yet a corridor of danger where one wrong maneuver can change lives in a heartbeat. In the SUV, Anthony Joshua was seated in the back, a position that in normal circumstances offers comfort and security. Beside him was another passenger, while the driver navigated the chaotic flow of traffic ahead. Behind them, their security detail followed in another vehicle, eyes scanning the road, ready to intervene if necessary. The driver, perhaps attempting to make up time, perhaps misjudging the space, initiated an overtaking maneuver, a risky choice on a road notorious for unpredictable obstacles. And then the collision happened. The SUV swerved sharply. Tires squealed against asphalt. The metal body of the vehicle tilted, a sudden, terrifying loss of control. Ahead, the stationary truck loomed, a massive, immovable object that seemed to materialize in the driver's path. In that fraction of a second, the world narrowed. The hum of the engine, the rush of air, the realization of impending impact. And then, the crash. The sound was explosive. Metal crunched, glass shattered, debris flew in every direction. Inside the SUV, Anthony Joshua and the other passenger were thrown against the seats, jostled violently. Glass cut across skin, sending stinging, bright pain coursing through limbs. There is a peculiar surreal quality to such moments. Everything slows down and accelerates simultaneously. You hear, see, and feel the disaster in a way that defies ordinary perception. Footage posted online shows Joshua shirtless, sitting amidst the wreckage, dazed and trying to comprehend what just happened. His eyes are wide, scanning the twisted metal, the shattered glass, the chaos that surrounds him. There is a pause in movement, a strange stillness amid the destruction, before the realization hits. Lives have been lost. 5 men were involved in total, and authorities would later confirm that 2 of them had died. Outside the vehicle, the scene was even more chaotic. Witnesses rushed toward the wreckage, some with the intention of helping, others simply frozen in shock. Phones were lifted to capture the moment, not out of malice, but because the human mind instinctively reaches for documentation in the face of incomprehensible events. Traffic slowed, then stopped, as cars swerved to avoid the crash, horns blaring, engines revving in panic. The soundscape of the expressway transformed into a cacophony of emergency, fear, and confusion. Anthony Joshua's security detail, following closely behind, quickly assessed the situation. The Lexus was mangled, the passengers injured, and the magnitude of the crash undeniable. They acted immediately, helping Joshua and the other occupant out of the wreckage, moving them to a safer vehicle. Reports indicate that Joshua sustained minor injuries, cuts, bruises, the kind of trauma that leaves lasting psychological impressions even if the body is relatively unharmed. But beyond the physical damage, there was the shock, the disbelief, the sudden confrontation with mortality that no amount of training or preparation could mitigate. And then there were the details that made the incident even more harrowing. Authorities indicated that the SUV was traveling above the legally prescribed speed limit at the time of the crash. The overtaking maneuver, which under normal circumstances might have been executed safely, failed catastrophically. The stationary truck, a seemingly innocuous obstacle parked on the side of the road, became an instrument of tragedy. The combination of speed, maneuvering, and road conditions created a perfect storm, leaving multiple lives hanging in the balance. Eyewitnesses describe a scene of utter devastation. One man, standing several meters away, recounted seeing the SUV collide with the truck, then spin slightly before coming to a halt. He spoke of the passengers inside, bloodied and shocked, yet moving, conscious, struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. Another witness described the sound of metal and glass colliding, a sound so jarring that it left him physically trembling for several minutes afterward. Social media erupted almost immediately. Videos circulated of the crash, of Joshua sitting shirtless in the mangled SUV, of emergency responders arriving at the scene. People shared screenshots, recounted what they saw, and speculated about what might have caused the accident. The footage is haunting, partly because it shows Joshua alive and moving, and partly because it cannot hide the magnitude of the wreckage. Every twist of metal, every shard of glass, every displaced object inside the SUV tells a story of chaos, of sudden violence, of lives intersecting in a tragic collision. And yet, amid the chaos, there is a human element that cannot be ignored. Anthony Joshua, even in his dazed state, begins to move with purpose. He is helped out of the wreckage, guided into another vehicle where he can speak with officials, recounting what happened, trying to make sense of the moment. His voice, likely calm on the surface but undoubtedly shaken underneath, represents the first glimpse of control after a total loss of it. The resilience required to do that, to remain composed while processing trauma, is something most of us can barely imagine. But the tragedy was not limited to Joshua. The fatalities, confirmed later, are a stark reminder of how indiscriminate accidents can be. Lives are extinguished in an instant. Families are left to grieve without warning. Communities are forced to confront the cruel randomness of fate. For Joshua, surviving meant relief, yes, but also an inevitable confrontation with guilt, the haunting question of why he survived while others did not. Survivor's guilt is an insidious companion, and for someone already in the public eye, it is compounded by scrutiny, commentary, and the constant replay of the incident across media platforms. Authorities later indicated that the crash was not solely the result of speed or maneuvering. Road conditions, traffic patterns, and possibly mechanical factors all played a role. The combination of these elements, in a fraction of a second, created a scenario from which there was no easy escape. The SUV collided with the truck, spun slightly, and came to rest in a state of twisted metal and shattered glass. And what of Joshua's perspective in that instant? Think of it. A man who has spent his life mastering the art of anticipation, who steps into the ring with opponents whose every move must be read and countered, suddenly confronted with a situation entirely outside his control. The irony is cruel. The world watches his strength and composure, admiring his victories, and yet this moment strips away all that external power, exposing vulnerability that is universal and unavoidable. It is impossible not to consider the larger implications. This was not just a car accident. It was a moment that exposed the fragility of life, the limits of control, and the unpredictable intersection of human choices. Anthony Joshua, for all his discipline, his training, and his preparation, became a participant in an event that no preparation could have fully mitigated. And as the dust settled on the expressway, the physical wreckage remained visible, but the emotional and psychological impact was just beginning to unfold. Emergency responders arrived to secure the area, treat the injured, and manage traffic. The scene was chaotic, intense, and emotionally charged. Joshua, while physically capable of walking, had to process the trauma alongside the practicalities of being a public figure, officials, security, and media all converging on a single, traumatic event. The human mind struggles to reconcile such an experience, and the aftermath often lingers long after the immediate danger has passed. And what about the SUV itself? The vehicle, once a symbol of security, status, and power, now lay mangled and twisted, a testament to the violence of the impact. Shards of glass glistened in the sun, metal panels bent at impossible angles. Every detail told a story of chaos and sudden destruction, of momentum and force that could not be controlled. But even amid the destruction, Anthony Joshua survived. His survival, while miraculous, brings with it questions that will linger. How did he escape serious injury? What role did luck play versus preparation? How does one reconcile relief with grief when others did not survive? And most importantly, how will this moment shape him, his family, and his future? And just when the world thought the immediate horror was over, new questions began to surface. Questions about the driver, the vehicle's speed, the security team, the nature of the expressway, and the preventability of the crash. These questions, each more pressing than the last, ensure that the story of the crash itself is only the beginning. The moment the SUV came to a halt, a strange stillness settled over the Lagos-Ibadan expressway. A temporary, uneasy calm after the violent chaos of the crash. For Anthony Joshua, though, there was no calm, only the jarring collision of shock, fear, and disbelief. He had survived the impact physically, but the mind does not process survival immediately. The senses are overloaded. The scent of scorched rubber, the metallic tang of blood, the glittering shards of glass catching the sun's glare, the cries of those injured or in panic. Every detail becomes amplified, every sound a note in a symphony of terror. Joshua's first instinct was likely to orient himself, check his own body, glance at the other passenger, attempt to understand what had just happened. Reports indicate that he was largely uninjured beyond minor cuts and bruises, yet being physically unscathed did not make the trauma any less real. He was dazed, shirtless, surrounded by the wreckage of a vehicle that moments before had represented security, status, and control. Now it was a cage of twisted metal, a reminder of how quickly life can pivot from normalcy to disaster. Around him, chaos continued to unfold. Witnesses began to approach the scene, unsure whether to offer help or keep a safe distance. Some captured videos on their phones, documenting the horror as it occurred. Horns honked from cars trying to navigate past the wreckage. Sirens approached in the distance, the metallic wail cutting through the ambient noise of the accident site. Emergency responders were on the way, but every second felt elongated, every movement delayed in the minds of those involved. Joshua's security team acted swiftly. The men trailing behind the SUV moved into position, assessing both the immediate threat and the needs of the passengers. They guided Joshua and the other occupant to safety, coordinating with arriving officials and helping to secure the area. It is a level of precision under extreme duress that few people could maintain, yet it is the hallmark of trained professionals accustomed to high-stakes situations. Their intervention undoubtedly saved lives, and it is a point of detail that will later emerge as critical in understanding why the human toll of the crash, while tragic, was not even greater. Meanwhile, the victims of the crash were being attended to in real time. 5 men were involved in total, including the passengers in the SUV and others impacted by the collision. Nigerian road safety officials later confirmed that 2 individuals lost their lives. The weight of that reality cannot be overstated: sudden, tragic, and irreversible. For Joshua, this fact would haunt him immediately and continue to echo in the days that followed. To survive an incident in which others perished is a shock to the psyche, a dissonance that can be as painful as any physical wound. The public, as is often the case in the age of social media, reacted almost instantaneously. Videos of Joshua sitting amidst the wreckage, his body marked by shards of glass, spread across platforms. Viewers expressed a mixture of relief, horror, and disbelief. Fans posted messages of support. Others speculated about the circumstances, the vehicle's speed, and the events leading to the crash. The speed at which this information circulated magnified the impact, turning a localized accident into a global story within hours. For Joshua himself, there was no opportunity to step back and process. He was quickly moved into another vehicle, where officials and security personnel conducted a rapid assessment of his condition. He communicated, likely in fragmented sentences, attempting to piece together the sequence of events. This is a surreal experience for anyone, but for someone constantly in the public eye, it adds an extra layer of complexity. Every movement, every expression, every word spoken could be scrutinized, dissected, and amplified across the world. Emergency services arrived soon after, coordinating with traffic control to clear the scene and attend to the injured. Ambulances transported victims to nearby hospitals. Joshua was taken for a medical evaluation, minor injuries confirmed, but the psychological trauma remained unmeasured. Every person involved, the driver, the passengers, the security detail, was processing their own version of events. Each perspective offered a slightly different lens, a fragment of the larger, incomprehensible puzzle that had unfolded in seconds. Authorities began to investigate the crash almost immediately. Preliminary reports suggested that the SUV was traveling above the speed limit and that the driver's overtaking maneuver failed, leading to the collision with the stationary truck. But as investigators often note, accidents of this magnitude rarely have a single cause. Road conditions, vehicle mechanics, traffic behavior, and human error all intersected to create a catastrophic outcome. Every detail would be scrutinized, from tire pressure to the angle of impact, each serving to construct a narrative of how this tragedy occurred. For Joshua's family, the moments after the crash were filled with uncertainty, fear, and heartbreak. Jacob Joshua, his brother, and Robert Joshua, his father, were likely engulfed in a storm of conflicting emotions: hope, worry, relief, and grief. Receiving news of such a high-profile accident is a double-edged sword. Relief that their loved one survived clashes with the horror of knowing others did not, and the fear of what emotional toll the survivor carries. It is an overwhelming combination, one that few outside of such intense circumstances can truly comprehend. Social media amplified these emotions, not always constructively. Messages poured in from fans, well-wishers, journalists, and strangers, all attempting to make sense of what had happened. The footage of Joshua in the wrecked SUV, widely circulated, became both a symbol of survival and a stark reminder of vulnerability. It is a duality that resonates deeply. Here is a man who has conquered fear in the ring, yet he is suddenly at the mercy of circumstances far beyond his control. Even the small details became magnified. The position of Joshua in the back seat, the presence of another passenger beside him, the location of the SUV relative to the stationary truck, all were examined, discussed, and debated. Experts on road safety weighed in, offering their analysis of speed, driver decisions, and vehicle dynamics. Every perspective added layers to a story that was already complex, adding nuance, but also increasing the sense of gravity and inevitability surrounding the crash. And yet, amid the chaos, Joshua's presence of mind, his ability to remain coherent, even partially, is striking. He interacted with officials, offered details, and maintained composure in a situation that would leave most people paralyzed by shock. This is part of the resilience that defines him, a characteristic built over years in the boxing ring, yet now tested outside it in the most unpredictable and unforgiving environment imaginable. The immediate aftermath was a convergence of human emotion, logistical chaos, and the emerging awareness of tragedy. Lives had been lost. Survivors were processing trauma. Families were on the brink of panic. Authorities were piecing together events. And the world was watching. The scale of the response, the intensity of public scrutiny, and the emotional weight of the moment combined to make the aftermath of the crash nearly as overwhelming as the collision itself. But even after the initial chaos subsided, questions lingered. How could such a crash occur on a road known for hazards? What exactly caused the SUV to lose control? How did Joshua escape with only minor injuries? And what of the 2 lives that were lost? These questions would form the backbone of the investigation, the public discourse, and Joshua's own reflection in the days to come. The aftermath is never just about physical injuries. It is about human reactions, decisions, and consequences. Every person involved, Joshua, his family, the driver, the security team, the victims, would carry the weight of this event forward. And every detail, from the SUV's speed to the placement of the stationary truck, from the immediate medical response to the reactions on social media, would contribute to the narrative of tragedy, survival, and reflection. And just when it seemed the immediate danger had passed, a new set of revelations began to emerge. Details about the circumstances of the crash, the speed, the maneuvers, and the human errors that would deepen the story, complicate the narrative, and bring into sharp relief the fragile balance between life and death. For Anthony Joshua, surviving a catastrophic crash was one thing. For his family, learning about it was an entirely different ordeal. Jacob Joshua, his brother, and Robert Joshua, his father, found themselves thrust into a whirlwind of fear, uncertainty, and heartbreak. When news first reached them, it was fragmented. A call here, a message there, snippets of social media footage filtered through friends and acquaintances. Each piece of information was a jolt, a spike of adrenaline and dread, because it wasn't just Anthony at risk. Lives had already been lost in the collision, and every second that passed without clarity intensified their anxiety. Imagine being in their shoes for a moment. One of the most famous athletes in the world, a man whose life is meticulously managed, suddenly caught in a disaster thousands of miles away from the public's gaze. Jacob and Robert could only wait, hoping the first reports weren't accurate, hoping Anthony would emerge unscathed. But hope, in moments like these, is fragile, and the uncertainty is suffocating. Every news alert, every phone vibration could carry confirmation of tragedy. When the first images of Anthony sitting shirtless in the wrecked SUV appeared online, their hearts sank. The man they had watched grow, train, and succeed was visibly shaken. His physical injuries were minor, yes, but the psychological toll was impossible to gauge from a photograph or video clip. The raw vulnerability on display was something they weren't accustomed to seeing. Anthony Joshua was a symbol of strength, both in their family and in the public eye. And now he looked human, exposed, fragile, yet, remarkably, alive. The reaction of Jacob Joshua was one of immediate, visceral concern. As a brother, he was confronted with the reality that Anthony, despite all his prowess and physical power, could be caught in circumstances entirely out of his control. It was a cocktail of relief and horror. Relief that Anthony survived, horror at the awareness that others did not. For Robert Joshua, the father, the pain was no less acute. Years of watching his son train, fight, and achieve greatness were suddenly punctuated by the terrifying knowledge of just how precarious life can be, regardless of fame or ability. Family dynamics in crises like this are complex. On the one hand, there is the need to gather information, coordinate with authorities, and ensure the immediate safety of the loved one involved. On the other hand, emotions run high. Fear, guilt, anger, and helplessness intertwine, creating a psychological storm that can overwhelm even the most composed individuals. For Jacob and Robert, each passing minute was a test of patience and resilience. Every phone call could bring relief or further anguish. Meanwhile, the wider Joshua family faced the same tension, a collective anxiety heightened by the public nature of the incident. In normal circumstances, news of a car accident is traumatic enough. When the accident involves a global sports icon, the scrutiny multiplies the pressure exponentially. Every family member had to navigate their own emotional response while managing the reality that millions around the world were watching, reacting, and speculating. Adding to the emotional complexity was the knowledge that the crash had resulted in fatalities. Anthony had survived, but two men had not. The juxtaposition of survival and death is a difficult concept to reconcile. Families of survivors often grapple with questions that have no answers. Why did my loved one live while others did not? Was there something that could have been done differently? These are the psychological echoes that ripple long after physical injuries have healed. Jacob Joshua's approach was one of immediate action. Coordinating with Anthony's security team, he sought to confirm the details of the crash. He needed to know, what injuries did Anthony sustain? Who else was involved? What measures had been taken to ensure his safety? Each answer, or lack thereof, shaped his emotional state. Robert Joshua, as a father, oscillated between fear for his son and grief for those lost in the crash. It is a unique blend of emotions that can destabilize anyone, no matter how accustomed they are to pressure or public attention. But even amid the fear and confusion, moments of resilience emerged. Anthony's family, though shaken, began to organize. They reached out to contacts on the ground in Nigeria, gathered updates from hospitals, liaised with authorities, and communicated with the security team. Each small piece of information provided a measure of control in a situation that had otherwise stripped them of certainty. The human instinct to act, to assert agency in moments of crisis, is universal, and in this case, it was amplified by the stakes and the public scrutiny surrounding Anthony Joshua. Social media and public attention added an unexpected dimension to the family's experience. Posts, comments, and videos were shared across platforms almost immediately. Friends, fans, and even strangers reached out with messages of concern and support. While some of this was comforting, it also introduced additional stress. Every tweet or post required mental energy to parse, which reports were accurate, which were speculative, and which were outright false. Navigating misinformation while processing a personal crisis is exhausting and emotionally taxing. Despite the pressure, Anthony's family remained focused on one priority: ensuring his well-being. Reports later confirmed that he had sustained minor injuries and was taken to a hospital for evaluation and treatment. The relief of knowing that his physical condition was stable, however, did not eliminate the emotional strain. The trauma of the crash itself, the knowledge of fatalities, and the awareness of how close Anthony came to more serious harm left a lingering tension. Jacob Joshua, in particular, felt the weight of responsibility. As a brother, he was not only emotionally invested in Anthony's safety, but also tasked with helping coordinate the response. He had to process his own fear while assisting in the practical steps needed to protect his sibling. This dual role, emotional and logistical, added a layer of complexity to an already intense situation. Robert Joshua, meanwhile, experienced the raw, visceral reactions of a father: fear, worry, and helplessness, tempered by pride in the resilience of his son. The family's reaction also highlights a universal truth about human connection and vulnerability. When tragedy strikes, it is the emotional bonds we have with those we love that are most acutely affected. Fame, wealth, or public recognition does not insulate anyone from the heartbreak, fear, or trauma of seeing a loved one in danger. For the Joshua family, these moments were a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of presence, care, and support. Amidst the fear, there were also glimpses of humanity and compassion from others at the scene. Witnesses, first responders, and local authorities all played roles in assisting the injured, managing the wreckage, and attempting to bring order to chaos. Each act of help, no matter how small, contributed to the survival of Anthony Joshua and mitigated the wider impact of the crash. And yet, no matter how organized or resilient the family was, the emotional toll was unavoidable. The crash was a stark reminder that life can change in an instant, that tragedy is often indiscriminate, and that even the strongest individuals and families must confront vulnerability. Jacob and Robert Joshua, like any family in crisis, were forced to navigate uncertainty, fear, and grief simultaneously. As the world watched, the Joshua family's response became part of the story. Their tears, their concern, their coordination with authorities, and their unwavering focus on Anthony's safety humanized a global icon. They reminded everyone watching that behind the headlines, behind the social media posts and viral footage, were real people experiencing real fear and real pain. But even as they processed the immediate aftermath, new questions began to emerge. Questions about what led to the crash, how it could have been prevented, and what the longer-term impact would be on Anthony Joshua's career and psyche. The emotional reaction of the family was only the beginning of a larger, unfolding narrative that would touch lives, provoke debate, and force reflection on fate, responsibility, and the fragility of life. While the immediate focus was understandably on Anthony Joshua, his survival, his condition, and the emotional toll on his family, the tragic reality of the crash extended far beyond the famed boxer. 5 men were involved in total, 2 of whom tragically lost their lives. These fatalities are a sobering reminder that accidents of this magnitude do not discriminate. They are indiscriminate, chaotic, and devastating. Every detail of the crash, from the SUV's speed to the positioning of the stationary truck, converged to create a scenario in which multiple lives were forever altered. The identities of the deceased were confirmed by Nigerian road safety officials, though initial reports focused primarily on the more visible figure of Anthony Joshua. But the human cost is not measured in headlines or media attention. Every lost life represents family members left to grieve, communities mourning, and futures that will never be realized. The 2 men who died in the crash were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their deaths add a layer of gravity and urgency to the story, forcing us to confront the consequences of choices, timing, and sheer misfortune. Eyewitnesses described the moments immediately following the crash in harrowing detail. Some spoke of the SUV spinning after impact, metal twisting, and glass scattering across the asphalt like shards of light. The injured, including Joshua and the other passengers, struggled to move, disoriented by shock and pain. The 2 men who would later be confirmed dead were trapped in the wreckage or nearby vehicles, and despite the immediate efforts of bystanders and emergency personnel, help came too late for them. The other passengers involved in the crash faced a different type of trauma. Physical injuries ranged from minor to moderate, but the psychological impact was profound. Experiencing a life-threatening event, witnessing deaths firsthand, and surviving when others did not can create lasting emotional scars. The survivors were faced not only with the aftermath of physical injury, but also with a complex blend of grief, guilt, and fear. Anthony Joshua's proximity to the fatalities introduces a psychological complexity that cannot be overstated. He had survived an incident that claimed lives around him. Survivor's guilt is a powerful, sometimes debilitating phenomenon, characterized by feelings of remorse and a haunting question: why him? Why not me? For someone constantly in the public eye, this guilt is magnified. Every photograph, every video, every retelling of the event serves as a reminder of both survival and loss. The crash also underscored the collective responsibility of everyone involved in the chain of events. The driver of the SUV, whose vehicle lost control, the other motorists navigating the expressway, and even infrastructure factors like road conditions all played a role in the outcome. The collision was not simply an isolated incident. It was the result of intersecting human decisions and environmental factors. Officials investigating the crash had to piece together these layers, reconstructing the moments leading up to impact to understand how 5 lives were suddenly thrown into chaos. Emergency responders, both on-site and at the hospitals, acted with urgency and professionalism. Paramedics arrived quickly to stabilize the injured, while traffic authorities managed the scene to prevent further accidents. The 2 fatalities, however, were pronounced at the scene or shortly after arrival at the hospital. Their deaths, while part of statistical reporting in traffic accidents, were profoundly human tragedies, leaving families and friends in shock and mourning. This segment of the story also highlights the broader risks associated with road travel, particularly on busy highways like the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. Speeding, risky overtaking maneuvers, and poor road conditions create a lethal combination. The fatalities in this crash serve as a grim reminder that accidents are rarely one-dimensional. They are complex events with cascading consequences, often claiming lives beyond the most publicized victim. The aftermath for the families of the deceased is almost unimaginable. Receiving news of a loved one lost in such circumstances is a trauma that reverberates across years and generations. Grief, anger, confusion, and the need for answers dominate their emotional landscape. For them, the media focus on Anthony Joshua may feel surreal or even frustrating, highlighting the disparity in attention between public figures and ordinary citizens. Yet the tragedy remains equally, if not more, devastating for those whose stories do not dominate headlines. For Joshua, knowledge of these deaths adds a profound emotional weight. While his physical injuries were minor, the moral and psychological implications are far more complex. How does one reconcile personal survival with the death of others in the same event? How does a person process gratitude for being alive alongside sorrow for those who were not? These are questions that may haunt him in private moments, long after the initial shock fades. The other survivors, too, face a difficult path forward. Physical recovery is often accompanied by emotional trauma, a reminder that accidents of this scale leave invisible scars. Therapy, counseling, and time become critical elements in healing, yet the presence of public scrutiny can complicate these processes. For Anthony Joshua, the public's gaze is unrelenting, and even as he begins to recover physically, the narrative of the crash continues to unfold in real time, played out across media platforms worldwide. The fatalities also raise questions about accountability and road safety enforcement. Officials have to determine whether the driver's actions were negligent, whether excessive speed was a factor, and how the crash might have been prevented. These are critical questions, not only for the families affected, but also for broader public policy, emphasizing the importance of road safety measures and adherence to traffic laws. It is worth noting that the human stories behind these fatalities extend beyond statistics. Each lost life had dreams, responsibilities, and relationships. Every individual involved in the crash, whether injured, surviving, or deceased, contributes to a network of human connections that are irrevocably changed. The ripple effects of tragedy extend outward, touching relatives, friends, colleagues, and strangers alike, all of whom must reconcile with the reality that lives can be altered or ended in a single instant. As the public continues to absorb the footage, news reports, and eyewitness accounts, there is a natural tendency to focus on the celebrity involved. Yet it is critical to remember the broader human toll. 2 men lost their lives, and 3 others, including Anthony Joshua, survived. The balance of life and death in this single moment forces reflection on vulnerability, mortality, and the randomness of fate. The story of the fatalities and others involved does not conclude neatly. Questions linger. Who exactly were the men who died? What circumstances placed them in harm's way? And how will their families cope in the coming days and weeks? Investigations will continue. Answers may emerge, but the emotional impact is immediate and irrevocable. And even as the details of the fatalities are processed, the narrative shifts again, moving from physical impact to emotional resonance, from immediate danger to long-term consequences for all involved. The crash was not merely a moment of collision. It was a convergence of human lives, choices, and vulnerability, each thread pulling at the others in ways that are still unfolding. After being pulled from the wreckage, Anthony Joshua was quickly transported to a nearby hospital for evaluation and treatment. The SUV crash had left him with minor injuries, cuts, bruises, and the kind of jolts to the body that most people would feel for days. But physical recovery, while essential, was only one part of the battle. The psychological trauma, the shock of surviving a deadly accident, and the weight of knowing others had died alongside him would prove far more complex to navigate. At the hospital, medical staff worked swiftly to assess the extent of his injuries. In situations like this, even a minor injury requires careful attention. Lacerations from broken glass can lead to infection if not properly treated. Bruises and contusions must be evaluated to rule out internal damage. For a professional athlete like Joshua, whose body is both his livelihood and his identity, ensuring proper medical care is paramount. Every muscle, every joint, every sinew is integral to his future performance, and even small injuries can have long-term implications if not properly addressed. Yet while the medical assessment focused on the physical, the emotional component loomed large. Being involved in a high-profile accident is traumatic under any circumstances, but when the world is watching, the pressure multiplies. Joshua was acutely aware that every movement, every photograph, and every statement would be scrutinized by the media, fans, and critics alike. The psychological strain of processing trauma under public observation is profound. Friends and family rushed to the hospital as soon as they could. Jacob Joshua, his brother, and Robert Joshua, his father, were present, ensuring that Anthony was supported and safe. Their presence offered both comfort and a reminder of the fragility of life. In moments like these, the emotional support of family is invaluable, helping to stabilize the mind even as the body begins to heal. Yet their own trauma was palpable, seeing a loved one in such a state, knowing that death had been a hair's breadth away, creates a mixture of relief and fear that lingers long after the immediate crisis has passed. Doctors, aware of Joshua's status as a professional athlete and public figure, were meticulous in their examination. Imaging scans, physical assessments, and observation periods ensured that no hidden injuries were overlooked. The human body, after a high-impact collision, can sustain damage not immediately visible. Even when outward appearances suggest minor trauma, internal injuries like concussions, whiplash, or subtle fractures must be ruled out. For Joshua, thorough care was both a medical necessity and a safeguard for his career. During this period, Joshua also began to process the emotional aftermath. Survivors of accidents often experience a complex mix of shock, gratitude, guilt, and anxiety. The knowledge that others had perished in the crash can exacerbate survivors' guilt, while the sheer randomness of survival can lead to existential questions. Why me? Why did this happen? How close did I come to death? For someone whose identity is built on discipline, control, and performance, being stripped of agency in such a situation can be disorienting. Psychologists note that the first 48 hours after a traumatic event are critical. Individuals may experience intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, or heightened anxiety. Sleep can be disrupted, appetite may wane, and emotional volatility is common. For Joshua, managing these reactions was complicated by the media attention surrounding the accident. Interviews, press inquiries, and social media commentary can amplify stress, making it harder to process trauma privately and safely. Joshua's recovery was also physically monitored with an athlete's perspective in mind. Even minor injuries can impact performance, training, and conditioning. Cuts on the hands, bruises along the torso, and shock to the muscular system all require careful management to ensure that future athletic endeavors are not compromised. Recovery protocols included wound care, rest, hydration, and gradual reintroduction of physical activity under medical supervision. Family and close friends acted as anchors during this period. Their presence provided a buffer between Joshua and the relentless media scrutiny, offering moments of privacy and reassurance. Emotional resilience is often strengthened by such support networks, allowing survivors to regain a sense of stability and control. For Joshua, this meant having trusted individuals nearby who could advocate for him, help him process events, and ensure that he was cared for holistically. Public reactions to the hospitalization varied widely. Fans expressed relief that he had survived and offered messages of encouragement. Media outlets focused on the accident, the fatalities, and Joshua's condition, while commentators debated the circumstances of the crash and its implications for his career. For Joshua, navigating this attention was another layer of complexity, balancing the need for personal recovery with the unavoidable intrusion of public scrutiny. Recovery, however, is not solely about surviving the immediate aftermath. It is also about rebuilding a sense of safety and trust in the world. After a high-impact crash, even routine activities like driving, commuting, or traveling can trigger anxiety or hyperawareness. Athletes like Joshua, accustomed to controlled environments, must now confront the unpredictability of life outside the ring. This psychological adjustment is as critical as physical healing and can influence both personal well-being and professional performance. Joshua's hospitalization also allowed for reflection on the human cost of the accident. The two men who had died in the crash were not public figures,